So first, before we get started, I want to talk a little bit about pheasants. Pheasants were first. There were many attempts to introduce them. They're non-native species to Minnesota and the U.S. Those initial attempts failed, but in 1916 we were finally successful in getting them established. And you can see by 1920s, 1930s, the population just took off. This is actually the harvest across time, but the harvest is a good measure of what the population was doing. So what is it that made them so successful? Okay, I promise it's really simple math. Bear with me. It's going to be some formulas. I'll walk you through them. It'll be pretty simple. But at its core, population size is determined by the number of birds in the population minus the deaths, plus movements of animals or people, however you want to think about it, in and out of the population. For the purposes of today, we're just going to focus on the bird side of this equation. First up, we'll talk about surviving hens. So here are some survival rates from research conducted in the upper Midwest, as well as some of our Great Plains neighbors, looking at hen survival in the spring and fall. So think of that as a breeding season, and then fall through spring, kind of that winter survival period. You can see there's a really wide range of reported survival rates in the literature. In general, pheasants live less than 3 years in the wild. I'd actually say that maybe 2 years you're doing pretty good. A year and a half, one breeding season, you might be done. So keep that in mind as we talk a little bit. That said, in the right conditions, they can live a little bit longer. The captivity study shows we can actually live up 18 years old. Okay, so let's imagine we have a starting population of 1,000 hens, and we want to multiply that and see how many hens we'll have left a year from then. So we're going to multiply that by that low end of that survival rate during the breeding season, at 25%, times that low end of the winter survival at 16%. By the next year, we're only going to have about 40 hens left. That doesn't sound so great if you had about 1,000 hens to start with. But if you flip that around and you take your starting population of 1,000 hens and you maximize the survival from the breeding season and through the winter, then you actually have about 538 hens left. That's how that math works out. Still not full population, but that's to be expected, right? This is a game bird. They just don't live very long lives. But 538 hens sounds a lot better than just 40 hens. So what are the causes of that mortality? Well, predation is by far and away the biggest source of mortality, followed by maybe some illegal hunting, machinery, things like mowing, vehicle kills, things like that. And then we have the effect of weather, and we can have the direct effect of weather, and some sort of weather extreme, like a really harsh blizzard or something like that. But more often what we see are these indirect effects of weather, where maybe it's a harsh winter and that bird has to travel a little farther to find food. It's going across the landscape. You picture a rooster walking across a white landscape. He's going to be easy pickings for a predator in that landscape if he has to go too far. So we have that indirect effect that can actually increase predation rates. All right, so we talked a little bit about hen survival. Let's talk about recruitment of young into the population. So hens will breed their first season. So any hens born last summer are going to breed for the first time this coming year. On average, they lay about 9 to 12 eggs per clutch. They lay more eggs at the beginning of the season than they do at the end. So if they have their first nest and it's lost, they're going to lay fewer eggs. If they lose that nest, they're going to lay fewer eggs the next time. So we really want to try to get that first clutch of the season hatched and be successful. They also just generally might have more resources at the beginning of the breeding season than say July or September, July, August, September, when they're kind of running out of resources. So clutch size can vary, but generally 9 to 12 eggs. Nest success, again, wide variation, 13 to 60% of nests. Hen success, which is kind of a measure of nest success as well as sort of the hatchability of those eggs. Sometimes you just see eggs that aren't viable and don't hatch. And then chick survival out to 6 weeks. Again, this is all from the published literature, really wide range there in terms of chick survival out to that 6 weeks. So let's do a little bit of math again. Let's take the minimums of clutch size, nest success, or we're going to use hen success, and then that chick survival. So 1,000 hens, she only lays 9 eggs, has low hen success, has low chick survival. In the end, we've maybe replaced those hens. We've got about 1,026 chicks, and then assume that some of those hens maybe didn't make it through the breeding season either. But if we do that same math using the maximum of some of those estimates, then we can have roughly 5.6 times as many chicks at the end of that 6 weeks if we give them the right conditions. So again, that sounds a whole lot better in terms of keeping the population size up. Those causes of nest and chick losses include, again, predation. Again, by far and away the biggest cause of chick mortality or nest mortality. And then for nests, it can also include things like machinery, weather, and abandonment. And then chicks as well, a little bit of weather. You might include some machinery there to talk a little bit about how chicks can't really fly very well for the first 3 weeks of life. So to be able to escape a mower or something like that is a concern when they're first learning how to fly, or if they tire out a little too quickly during those first couple of weeks. Okay, so in general, pheasant demographics are driven by the sort of live fast, die young strategy. They're going to have these really high recruitment rates, but low annual survival. A large annual variation in the population typically is due to weather, but that can fluctuate. So what I have here is a graph that shows our August roadside survey index on the left-hand side, and then the harvest on the right-hand side. So the black circles that are filled in is the August roadside survey index. The unfilled circles are the harvest. You can see those two track pretty closely. So from one year to the next, we see little ups and downs, and that's just annual variation. But what you can see in the 1950s and early part of the 1960s is really high pheasant population, and then we drop down. So that is driven by something other than that annual variation due to weather. Okay, so we'll talk about that here in a second, but really what I want you to focus on is just if we want to do well for pheasants, and I would include other grassland birds as well too, what we really want to do is maximize this part of that equation. We want to, when they're here breeding, we want to give them the best chance at pulling off a successful clutch. We don't worry too much about the death part of that equation. Mostly it's due to hunting here in Minnesota with pheasants. That's why we have a rooster-only season. They're considered an expendable part of the population. They're birds that probably would have died anyways. So yeah, we have a rooster-only season for a reason, and we don't worry too much about that. Sorry guys, but roosters don't really matter. And in the wild, it takes about one rooster to fertilize the eggs of about 10 hens. In lab studies, it can actually be one rooster to 50 hens. So we really could harvest 9 of those roosters and still do okay and keep our population up, not worry about genetic viability and things like that. So that's why we want to focus on that birth side of the equation when we're talking about doing well for pheasants. All right, so back to that first graph. Why were pheasants so successful? Why have they been so successful? And what's going on here? Why do we see this really high harvest and population size, and why does it dip down? What's going on there? Anyone want to take a guess on that?
The amount of habitat.
The amount of habitat. So if you think about it, I like to call this the diversified farming area. Up until about the mid-1960s, yeah, we had corn and beans, but we also had small grains. We had grazing. We had wetlands. We had those odd patches of habitat that were still out there in the landscape. And then beginning in the 1960s, we see the sort of the modernization of farming, bigger, larger, faster equipment. And I put on here the CRP era. So the Farm Bill in the 1980s, by about 1987, I think we start to see some conservation reserve program acres go on the landscape. And I call the CRP era from that 87 to 2007, because in Minnesota, we actually kind of maximized our CRP acres in about 2007, have been steadily losing some acres since then. But even just through CRP, you can see the bump we get in our pheasant population, the average, compared to prior, the decades just prior to that. So habitat really is the key in that diversified farming area. Pheasants are just really well suited for that. Okay, so talk a little bit about what we need, what makes pheasants so successful. They can be really prolific if we give them the right habitat. So what is the habitat that they need? So we're going to break it down into a few things. We need good reproductive habitat, and that includes that nesting and the brood-rearing habitat, ideally undisturbed. And then we also need good winter habitat. When we talk about winter habitat, we're not just talking about cover, but we're talking about food availability. For nesting cover, undisturbed grass is really the most prime thing. That's what most hens are choosing, but they'll also look at hay and hay fields, pasture, small grains. There's been some studies so far looking at cover crops. Hens don't really select cover crops at any higher rate for nesting, but as many of you who probably do cover crops know, it's great brood rearing habitat. But the female is going to select that nest site and incubate. She's looking for, by the time she's looking to lay her eggs in mid to late April, certain structure of the habitat, some amount of new growth combined with some residual standing dead vegetation to help hide that nest. In terms of that nesting period length, because she's laying 9 to 12 eggs on average for that first clutch, she might not lay an egg every day. She might take a day off. So we need about 2 weeks to lay 12 eggs minimum. That's why it says 2+ weeks. I know 2 + 3 does not equal 6. I'm aware of that. But it's kind of an average, at least 2 weeks. And then at least 3 weeks for incubating. So early in the nesting season, when it's a little bit cooler, it's going to take a little bit longer, about 28 days to hatch those eggs out. Later in the season, when weather's warmer, she'll be more like clockwork and probably be hatching out at 23 days once she starts sitting on those eggs. So minimum of at least 6 weeks of undisturbed time to both lay and incubate those eggs. And that's just for the nesting. I'm not including, again, here the fact that chicks aren't well flighted for the first 3 weeks. So if you want to provide that habitat as well, too, you got to think about that early brood rearing period as well, too. Okay, speaking of brood rearing, what are we looking for? By far and away, insects are going to be the most important thing for them. These are chicks with tiny little legs. They need to keep up with mom. She's going to leave them behind if they're not keeping up. So they need to be able to grow fast and be able to keep up with her. And it's not just one thing to be able to have insects to eat, but you need to be able to run and catch those insects, right? So it's one thing to have food available. It's another thing for it to be, catchable. So they're looking for a lot of insects, and that's going to help them grow really quickly. Generally speaking, in the past, we haven't thought about food as being a limiting factor for game birds in North America. There is some evidence from the European literature that food could be limiting. There's little evidence for that in North American studies, not factoring in pesticides. I'll touch on that here in a second as well, too. But generally speaking, if all things are looking good out there for them, then there should be plenty of insects available. They're well evolved, well adapted to timing their hatch with that flush of insects that's going to occur. But we're going to get more insects when we have a good diversity in our vegetation. So if we're talking about prairie, having something with a lot of flowering plants, that's going to attract and produce more insects just because you have more of those flowering plants. But also it's going to create a more open understory with the caveat that grazing can also establish that. So you think about what those grasses do at the end of the growing season. They're going to get laid down by the snow, they're going to fall over, it's going to create more of a litter layer. Whereas those broadleaf forbs, those flowering plants, generally speaking, those stems stay a little more upright. It creates a little more open understory for those chicks to be able to run around and catch those. So you get a little bit less of that litter layer buildup when you have that more diverse prairie, in addition to just attracting more bugs. But again, row crops are great foraging habitat as well too. So I've done some studies where we're trying to mark pheasant chicks to be able to track them, and the hen is almost always taking them into those row crops, and we have permission from the landowner. We're laying there in the row crops trying to catch pheasant chicks, and I'm sitting there looking, and maybe it's before spring has occurred, but there's lots of bugs there for them. But the addition of something like cover crops can go a long way towards providing even more food resources for them. And if you don't want to do cover crops, then something like conservation tillage compared to conventional tillage. There is some evidence that birds will even nest in conservation tillage. Again, prairie grasslands are probably going to be the preferred, but in some cases, I have a former colleague and coworker who did a study in Illinois, and she actually found things like robins nesting on the ground in conservation tillage later in the season. So my guess is they failed elsewhere, and they were like, well, I'll give it a try. And they went and put their nests on the ground, in addition to the other species you would normally expect to see there. But the other advantage of something like conservation tillage, no-till, is that you're going to have this buildup, and again, that's going to create a little bit of a litter layer to attract some bugs. And again, you don't want crop pests, but by building in a system, you're also introducing the system that you need to have those beneficial insects as well to help control your pest population. So hopefully those things don't scare you, and I think it does really well for pheasants and creates good brood habitat for them. All right, so I mentioned the pesticides. So there is some accruing evidence that pesticides may be more important in explaining the grassland bird declines that we're seeing compared to things like habitat loss and fragmentation. We used to really worry about habitat loss. Fragmentation, we still do. I'd argue that maybe you worry about some sort of synergistic effect where you have a small habitat patch. It's more likely to be impacted by pesticides. But if you're not aware, a lot of I think in the last couple of years, there's news that 30% we've lost 30% of our songbirds over the last 50 years. But grassland birds in particular are one of the fastest, most steeply declining groups of birds out there. So we do worry about that in our farmland prairie ecosystems. To that extent, I had a graduate student and worked with some colleagues to do a study a few years ago. It's now wrapped up and published, but we were actually looking at the potential for soybean aphid insecticides to drift onto public lands when, or you really can think about it as any grassland, when the neighboring habitat was row crops. And spoiler alert, we did find that drift occurred. It's heavier along the edge, like you might expect, than on the interior, but it does reach the interior. We didn't find levels that would be concerning. So primarily we worry about chlorpyrifos, something like lorsban, which is now banned by the EPA. At the time of the study, it had not been yet banned. But we didn't see levels that would actually cause straight bird mortality. But we did find levels that were concerning from a morbidity standpoint. So maybe the birds did get sprayed, they weren't feeling really well. And then you think about those interactive effects of they're not feeling well, they're a little sluggish now, they're more likely to be picked off by a predator. So you do kind of worry about decreased survival rates when things like that happen. In addition, in the type of sampling we did see a depression in insect availability immediately after spraying. It rebounded by maybe week 3 or 4. But again, we did have some concerns that there might be fewer insects available to those chicks when they were growing. So typically that spraying is happening late July, August, maybe into September. It's a really vital period for pheasant chicks to be able to grow, as well as other wildlife out there as well too. That study was funded by an Environmental and Natural Resources Trust Fund, as recommended by the Legislative Citizens Commission on Minnesota Resources. More recently, they've also given Minnesota DNR, the state legislature has given Minnesota DNR some additional funding to continue to look at insecticide issues. So we have a variety of studies looking at neonics in particular now. So neonic treated seeds and what impact that might have on wildlife. So we've got a project going with deer, a project going with pheasants, and then our grouse scientist is doing some research with grouse as well too. So we'll have more results on all of those things in the future. I'm not prepared to talk about any of that today, but just wanted to make you aware that we are looking at some of those things, and that's one of the reasons why I get so excited and passionate in a group like this, because of the idea that regenerative agriculture can really be introducing some best management practices to make the landscape a little more wildlife friendly. All right, so moving on, let's talk a little bit about that nesting habitat that's out there. So when we talk about something like our prairie farmland landscape of Minnesota or other places in the upper Midwest, we don't have a lot of native prairie left. Usually what we have is kind of in this matrix with row crops, or maybe with woody vegetation. So there's a lot of research to show that we have edge effects when we have woody vegetation. So woody vegetation can not only just make it really hard to manage your prairie, it's supposed to be managed as prairie, and suddenly you got trees growing, so if you don't stay on top of that management. But also those edges just kind of create perching spots and thermal refuge for a lot of nest predators, not just predators of pheasants, but also ducks and songbirds, as well as brood parasites, which are a concern, things like brown-headed cowbirds that are obligate brood parasites of songbirds. So we won't talk about them today, but that's kind of one of the concerns we have when we see a lot of woody vegetation in what's supposed to be a grassland or near a grassland. So that's something you want to think about as you're managing your land, is maybe you want to provide good reproductive cover, but then you also want to have some habitat for deer. So when you're thinking about that, trying to think about how to keep those far apart, or at least make sure the trees and shrubs aren't getting into your grassland. And I think Mark will be talking a little bit more about some of that. We also need to talk about patch sizes and kind of the landscape configuration. Generally speaking, I will say there is no one-size-fits-all approach. There's always exceptions to the rule. But generally speaking, we see lower pheasant as well as songbird nest success when we talk about small patches or strips or a single large block of grassland, compared to blocks that are more than 40 acres in size or clusters of several large blocks. And so if you think about what that might look like on the landscape, that single large block or strip habitat in a landscape like this If I'm a bird, there's not a lot of places for me to nest if I'm a grassland bird or a pheasant. But so I'm going to end up in one of those patches of green. But if I'm a predator, it's also a little bit more of a smorgasbord for me, right? It's going to be a little bit easier to search those habitats because I don't have to look around as much. Compared to the landscape on the right, where that green, if that all represents grassland vegetation. So now you've got a lot of places for birds to disperse to. And now it's going to be a lot harder for a predator to find a meal on that landscape. That said, like I said, there's always an exception to the rule. And I maybe argue that maybe one of those small patches of grass in that landscape could be less productive than this one big, large block here, because if I'm a predator, I'm probably still going to go to that landscape. It's going to be harder for me to find a meal, but once I'm in that landscape, I might be more likely to search the small patch rather than the big patch. So I consider job security for me to have to tease those things apart, but yeah, that's why we keep doing research, I guess. But yeah, that's why I say there's not a one size fits all approach. It kind of just depends. But these are some of the things you want to think about if you have the opportunity to think about how that habitat fits in the landscape. Okay, we've talked a little bit about nesting season, what the hen is looking for in vegetation, the idea of edge effects and woody vegetation, landscape, patch configuration. Let's talk a little bit about winter habitat. So as I mentioned, winter habitat is both food and cover. Before we dive into that though, let's just talk a little bit about how adaptive pheasants are. So despite not being a native grouse, despite not having all those adaptations that a native grouse has, like feathered legs and feathered toes and things like that, burying themselves into the snow, they can actually do pretty well. They're really good at conserving energy during those extreme cold periods. When our Minnesota DNR managers find birds dead in the winter, maybe hit by a car on the road, they're not dying of starvation. They have plenty of fat reserves. So they can kind of just go into a state of torpor, is what we call it, where they just remain still, conserve some energy. They can lose a big part of their body mass. They probably don't feel well when they're doing that, but they can if they have to. Ideally, we're creating a situation where they don't have to. That hen there in that picture, you might not be able to see it. She's got some ice buildup under her feathers, under her wing and tail. She's probably not feeling that well. She probably had to be exposed for a little too long and looking for a spot to eat. So she's been out for a little too long and starting to ice up. Reality is most birds don't move very far in their lifetime. Most pheasants, when I say birds here, I'm talking about pheasants, that if a pheasant moves a mile in its lifetime, it's actually made a big move. Most of them kind of live and die in that same area. Some will move a little farther. Occasionally we get a bird get up and move 3 miles, 10 miles. But most of them are looking for what they need right in that sort of same square mile. But in winter, they like to go even shorter distances, so about less than half a mile on average. So when we talk about providing cover and food for them, we want it to be in close proximity. Those farther movements, like I said, you're going to be just a bullseye in the landscape if you're a brown bird having to cross a white landscape. Okay, so thermal cover. They need a spot to get warm, try to stay warm. So what that can look like, ideally something like a cattail marsh or a short swamp. When we talk about things like that, we want them to be a minimum size because too small of a patch that's going to blow in with snow, it's not really going to provide that thermal cover. Any of you who are pheasant hunters know what these look like late season. It's a highway of tracks for all sorts of wildlife. So you know that it's not just pheasants, it's deer, it's the rabbits, it's everything going in there to get into that thermal refuge. So ideally we have these things, but they're big enough and wide enough to be robust to that drifting snow when we get into those, that January and February. I feel like we're in January and February already this year. Like my body was not ready for what we experienced in this last week or two, but sometimes when I'm at home trying to stay warm, I think about having to be I really do. I think about being a pheasant out there trying to stay warm. So, and then I kind of stop complaining. We can also talk about thermal cover being in the form of shelter belts. So a 3 to 5 acre block, ideally, again, long enough and wide enough to be robust to drifting snow. Several rows of conifers. A few caveats with this though. We don't want it to be tall deciduous trees because we just talked about how trees make it really hard to manage your grass. Trees produce seeds that are going to move into your grass. So if you're going to have a shelter belt and you're going to have deciduous trees, ideally try to keep it away from that grass. And if you're going to plant conifers, just be aware of how close or the fact that they can self-thin over time reduce the effectiveness of that as thermal cover. So Again, whether it's a deciduous tree or a conifer, you're also providing potential perching spot or thermal refuge for nest predators come the nesting season. So those are some of the caveats when you think about shelter belts as winter cover. And quite honestly, it's one of the reasons why you see Minnesota DNR going in and sometimes ripping out some of those old shelter belt winter cover spots, because we just know that we'd rather actually see things in the form of cattails or shrub swamps. Okay, so staying warm is one thing, but finding the energy to kind of get that little furnace going in the first place if you're a bird or other wildlife is another thing. So food availability. If it's not a harsh winter, there should be maybe plenty of, if you have a good grassland, diverse grassland out there, should maybe be plenty of seeds. If there's not too much snow on the landscape, you'll see them obviously digging around on your fields, trying to find some of that waste grain. But we consider it a harsh day for a pheasant when the temperature gets below zero and there's more than a few inches of snow, usually we say 6 inches. And then again, as we get later into the season, we start worrying about that freeze-thaw cycle. Now they've got to dig through that icy layer. So the best way to maybe think about providing food is in the form of a food plot. So for pheasants, it's going to be corn or sorghum. They're going to be the best, most energetically efficient for them. They will help increase hen survival, again, when you keep that food near their cover in the winter. Ideally, it's available every winter. It's a predictable, reliable food source. And then again, sufficient size to support other wildlife. We know that other wildlife are using it. So you're not just managing maybe for pheasants or deer, you're also managing for the turkeys and the rabbits and the small mammals and everything else that's going to be hitting up that food plot. And again, something that might protect from drifting snow. Alternatively, you can use the food plot to help kind of keep your grasslands a little more open from maybe where you have more of that deciduous cover. So that's all I have. I'm going to turn it over to Mark, and I think he's going to go through a few more specific scenarios and talk a little bit more about management.
Well, I'll see. I want to hear myself talk. So, my name is Mark Pieper, the farm bill biologist out of Lyon County. And since Nicole was kind of telling the biology of it, I was going to talk what you kind of learned early, kind of how to incorporate it onto a farm property. So wildlife habitat. How many of you own farms, or what's the people out here? What do you work with the landowners, or you own land? What do you think about wildlife habitat in your mind? Could be a positive thing, could be a negative thing. Negative is can't make money off of it. Well, positive, that's my honey hole. That's where I get my deer, get my pheasant. What do you guys think in your mind what wildlife habitat is?
Undisturbed vegetation.
Okay. Is it?
Managed area.
Yeah. Gotcha.
Not typical crop, or left maybe for left standing crop.
Gotcha. Okay. Anybody else?
Diverse native cover.
Okay. Alrighty. Well, the definition is a wildlife habitat is an area disturbed horizontally and vertically across the landscape that fulfill the needs of specific wildlife species for the basic requirements of food, water, reproduction, and protection against predators and competitors. So, in the nutshell, what Nicole was saying through her thing, what pheasant needs, wildlife only needs 4 essential things. Pretty simple if you break it down. We can do all the scientific things, but really, when you think about it, they only need 4 things. They need water, food, cover, and space. If you can provide all those, you're going to have habitat. Granted, it depends on what species or birds or deer or whatever. It might take a little more effort, different quality, different space, but when you're thinking about if you're trying to implement habitat on your property, and specifically on pheasants or so, what do you think? Where are they getting their water? Where's their food source come? Do they have cover and space? If you have those 4, you'll have that species, you'll have pheasants, you'll have deer, whatever you want. I mean, you can manage it how you want. So how can we manage wildlife on a property with water quality and soil health in mind? They kind of do go hand in hand. profitability as well as benefit to the environment. Pheasant, I got a little pheasant. I don't know if you see the hen right there. It's kind of blending. And then deer, different kind of habitat, but manage it correctly, you'll reap the benefits of it. So, with working with landowners, we usually kind of use 3 different type of land masses. There's more to it, but these are kind of broad spectrum. We got cropland, grassland, pasture, forest, and woodland. When I talk to the landowners, that's why I kind of see what do they got, and then kind of go from there to how to manage it. First off, we're gonna talk about cropland. Anybody know what kind of map this is?
Harvest map.
Harvest map. Yep, they basically tell you the green is where you're making money and the red is where you're losing money. Pretty simple. If you're a producer and if you don't have this kind of technology on your combine, you still probably, if you're farming that field long enough, you still know where you're losing money and where you're making money. If you're farming long enough, you just know where it's at. What this is, what's a good indication is what can we do out there. Just remember this map in the future. So, different practices we can put on cropland to help pheasants, can help deer. Prairie strips, great tool to have. Filter strips, grass waterways, wetland restoration, food plots, and cover crops. These are just a few practices. There are a lot more, but kind of break them down. So, on the top left, prairie strips. They're starting to become a little more popular. Iowa kind of started way back, yes, in the 2000s, early 2000s, and they're really beneficial. They're good for along field edges, especially where you have trees. You got crop ground. When you ever notice it, when you plant, where's low yields at on the edge of your fields, right? You got compaction during tractors, your combine, where you park your equipment, or if you're farming along trees, you got all the roots that kind of mess with them, as well as the moisture and stuff. So if you put a prairie strip, bump it out for 30 feet, make it wide enough for your running your equipment, then you can plant your crops right up to it. You'll provide habitat for your pheasant, deer, as well as maybe increase your profitability off of that field because you're not running equipment back and running your digger across. Field's expensive. Running the extra fertilizer trying to get your corn and bean grow. So, and so it's a really good practice to have on your field edges, as well as it's really decent even in between the fields if you got some quality low areas where you can have them plant it, and then lift up and drive across and then plant it again. The middle one is grass waterways. A lot of times you see filter strips, in the middle one. If you see filter strips, a lot of times you see a lot of brome. And if you go farther down, it's fescue, but brome. But these also could be a good another wildlife habitat issue. Along creeks edges, instead of planting brome, you can plant warm season grasses, which is really good for pheasants to get away from predators, chicks to run around. Then your top right, you got grass waterways. Most of those are usually your cool season grasses as well, but you can plant warm season. And again, it's kind of a good corridor, kind of get escape from predators. If you got long crops, they jump in there, go out, feed, and then jump back in, hide away from their predators, hawks and stuff. And the wetland restoration. Now, a lot of people don't like to see water in their fields. But wetland restoration can be beneficial, especially if you got really wet areas. And if you keep tiling your field, you keep tiling it, and it keeps flooding and flooding. Naturally, you probably have a little wetland. Best thing, sometimes it is just break that tile and let that water flow into it. So you're not farming it. It kind of settle all the nutrients on the rest of your field and provide adequate habitat for your wildlife as well. And then the middle one is just leave a couple rows of corn along the edge. As Nicole said, winter habitat. They need food, corn. Just leave them up, provide a good food source for your birds, even for deer. And then the far right corner is a cover crop. As it provides pretty good food source during the year. If you plant it there later in the fall, it may not be as beneficial for pheasants for seed, but it does provide food for your deer. But it will really benefit your broods in the upcoming year. So back to the map. So with those kind of practices I talked about, what area do you think some of these practices work at? Work good.
Definitely right along that ditch first start. That tells me filter strip for sure.
Yep.
And then even if you're getting some red sticking out a little bit too, and even some of those red areas too, probably grass waterways more towards the middle of the field. But and yeah, then if you got really concentrated red areas, maybe it's opportunity for wetland restoration.
Yep, exactly. So definitely. This map I got off from one of our Ag Precision. But yeah, definitely you can see grass waterway there, losing money. Put some grass strips there along the tree edge, probably getting affected by the trees, taking the moisture out. Plant some grass in there. And then that will provide a lot of good corridors for your birds to potentially other habitat to them without getting picked off by predators. So, grassland pastures. So, what are you thinking about grassland pastures? Well, it's rye grass. What else do we need to do for water quality or soil health? Well, this is a picture of brome grass. If you don't have very diversity of landscape, or basically just a cool season, it does provide some habitat, it does provide some cover, it does provide some soil benefit. But if you can get native grasses, more mixture of landscape, it provides better food, better habitat, better health of the soil, and better water quality. So, a couple of things to manage your grasslands. Prescribed fire. Who likes to burn? Fire is a good tool. I like to burn. Every time I can get a match out, I like to put smoke in the air. So it's fun. It's a great, quick, effective method. It's not for everybody. And sometimes it just doesn't work, depending on where you're located. If you're closer to a town, you might have issues because of smoke dropping on houses. If you don't feel comfortable with it, worry about getting out of control when deal with it. But overall, if you're comfortable with it, if you know somebody's comfortable, it's a quick, fast tool to help manage your grasslands. Another thing is remove woody vegetation. The woody vegetation is kind of the edge effect, which you allow birds to fly on top of trees and then scout out for your pheasants. Deer, not so much. They kind of like little shrubby areas, but those individual trees are really not doing any good in your prairie anyways. They're not really accomplishing anything, just harboring your predators. So, cut those out, let your native grasses grow to provide cover, your food, and your insects for pheasants. Third is interseeding. Fun stuff. Takes a little bit of work, but if you got a good, decent warm season, but you got a little brome grown in, kill the brome, but you need a little more forbs for your insects, for your brood habitat. Go in, burn it, mow it down, then you interseed it. Plant more forbs, get more flowers, get more insects, draw more birds in there, deer in there. And then you got food plots. They provide food source as well, some ground cover. Wetland restorations as well. Provide just another cattail sloughs, more winter cover for birds, even for deer. Help reduce erosion. We get runoff up from a field, it runs in, captures in that wetland. Water quality benefit for the soil health and the water quality. And then last, grazing. Grazing is a great tool. If it's done correctly, it's a horrible tool if you don't do correctly. So, but fortunately, if you graze and you make a mistake and you don't continually graze it, it will recover. It might take a little longer, but it will recover. So here's some different pictures. They're actually doing some interseeding a couple weeks ago. We have a site that was an old rim site. It was all brome, and they're trying to convert it back into natives. So we did a couple management. They burned it last spring. Then we did a couple applications of spray, but we had a very wet later of the year, so the grass grew really tall. So before they sprayed, we came in and hayed it to get all that vegetation off. And then wait a couple weeks, let it green up, then spray it to kill it, and then drill it into the last week right after we had a little bit of snow, which I'm kind of excited to see how well, because you got to drill it when it's just froze, and then later on that day it warmed up, so hopefully that warm kind of sunk that seed back into that soil a little deeper and compact it, and then have some frost weather so it kind of freezes in. So then fire. So like I said, it's a great tool. Burns. It's quick. Sometimes, and also there's different times of the year you can burn depending on what you're trying to manage. Sometimes you see everybody with CRP have to burn early in the year, March, April. Basically, their burning is just trying to rejuvenate the warm season grasses and forbs. But if you're trying to control, say, brome, you might want to wait till, if you're able to do it, you might try burning late June or mid-June when it's a little greener at stage 2, stage 3. So where they're shooting all that energy, you burn it and hopefully stun it back. It's a little more smokier. It doesn't get that flashy feels of big flames, and it creeps a little bit. It works great. And it's a great tool. And then we got food plots, sorghum, great winter habitat. A lot of people plant it. Long edges, keep birds, because if anybody hunts, that's where everybody likes to hunt. The corn and sorghum patches. You always can find tracks in there. And then you got your woody vegetation you need to take care of. Forestry mulcher. For cedars, get rid of cedars. Everybody claims cedars are great deer habitat. Even for pheasant habitat, they're not. Because once they get established, they get established, they get established, and they get established. And then before you know it, if you don't manage them, you're not having a prairie, you're having a cedar lot. So then a lot more work to take care of them. So if you see cedars, just get rid of them. So, talk about grazing. This was a couple years ago. We had grazed. This was old rim site. You kind of see it kind of back there. It's more of was like a brome. It was originally native warm season grasses. It was put in crop in early 90s. So the seed mixes weren't very diverse. It was mainly switch and big blue, and maybe a couple of forbs in there. But before they grazed it, I didn't get a picture of it, but this was mainly just smooth brome. So we had them go in there and graze in June. This was in 2021, right in the drought. I'm not gonna lie, when we did it, we had 20 cow pair. We had 20 cow calf pair, and when they got done, and it got really, really dry, we thought, well, we might have left them out there a little too long and kind of did some damage out there. But not even 3 or 4 months later, same picture, same spot. The big blue responded. We got timely rain, and big blue came. So it's grazing is a great tool. And if you farm, if you work with operators that have livestock, rotation is your friend. Maybe graze it down to a certain height, now to the bare ground, and then you move it, and then you move it again. Kind of easy, not easy, but have a system where you can move it so you have different levels of grass, so it provides habitat for your birds, as well as you're not running your pastures down, so you have better water quality health, and reduce the erosion. And then forestry. Burning. Like I said, fire. Burning in timber. When you see fire, it's a great tool. I like to advocate fire. It's just so easy to use. For your foresters, people know what the term is. Forest stand improvement is to improve your timber stand. Maybe is you got some. This is more for deer, but if you got a few oak trees, you can go out there and do some group openings, plant some oak trees to get more nut mass in there to have deer. Or if you need, it's just timber's overcrowded, you go select trees that benefit what you're shooting for and then thin out certain area to get different age classes of timber in there. So you get a little more sunlight, get a little more vegetation, get a little bit of regrowth, a lot of different things. Tree plantings. Plant your oaks, hickories, your nut-bearing trees that deer would eat, or other wildlife would eat. You can plant maples, but you don't have to worry about those because those usually come in pretty easy. And cedars, don't plant cedars. So, and then timber harvest is a great tool for management for your deer as well. It can open up broad areas, plus you get economic value off of it. If you have pretty good overstocked stand of oaks, have a logger come in, you do selective harvesting, you can make some income, as well you improve the habitat. It might look a little trashy when it's done in the areas that they harvest, but it's really good habitat for deer, even turkeys and stuff. If you're a big turkey hunter, have it logged for a year, come back the next year, turkeys will be in there. That's where they may not roost in there, but they'll go in there to protect stuff. So, timber harvest is a really good tool as well. So, picture burning in timber. Fire in timber is not as glorious or as dangerous as you think as you see out west. Especially here in Midwest, if there's a wildfire and you got a place to run, I would run into the timber because usually that's when it's going to slow down. In the prairie, it's a fast fuel. So, but when it hits the timber, especially when there's leaf cover on there, humidity, it traps the humidity, and the humidity rises. When the humidity rises, the flame length goes down, and it's a lot easier to control. So when you see wildfires out west, like in California, Montana, Oregon, when you see big 200, 300 foot flames. If you're burning, you have those here, you probably shouldn't be burning because it's probably a little too dry to burn. But for most, if you do prescribed fire, it's going to be looking like this. It's going to be slow, creeping along, kind of burning the area to rejuvenate your trees, especially oaks. Oaks really are fire dependent. Most of them are. And so it will help them regenerate and grow new growth. You got logging, timber harvest, tree planting along riparian areas that provide good corridors of nut mass, good water quality, as well as protection for deer, turkey, and stuff. And then timber stand improvement, kind of thinning out areas, allow sunlight, get natural regrowth growing, reduce, kind of get out maybe the junk trees, such as Siberian elm or cottonwoods, maples. I don't like maples either because they're very aggressive. Just your undesirable species, get more of your nut mass trees that provide wildlife habitat. And by doing that, if you have healthy forests, you're going to have healthy soils. If you have healthy soils, you're going to have reduced erosion and better water quality. So, here's a little scenario. This is a farm down in southwest Minnesota. This is kind of the landscape I work in. A little more prairie, but this is kind of along a river. So, kind of the background of it. This is kind of to the west side of the river. That's kind of a wet area, kind of swampy. To the east side, it's pretty decent quality farm ground. Obviously along the fit, you kind of see the compact, kind of different soil types. If you kind of look at it, kind of look like along the edge, kind of a little lower quality. To the south is grass. To the north is a little bit of grass and another field. So when I go out, when I talk to landowners, give a map, kind of see what their thoughts are, kind of brainstorm what their objectives are, and how can we improve the water quality, and how can we improve the habitat for pheasants and deer. So from this map, what do you guys recommendations for the information I gave you? What would you do kind of improve that for habitat while incorporating it? Grasses, you got plant grasses, cover crops, timber, sand improvement. What do you guys think? Where would you plant some grass at?
The west side.
The whole west side? Yeah. That's what I would do too, because it'd be it's wet. These guys are losing money on it. It gets a crop once every 5 years. Grass be great, and there's financial assistance for that. So why not plant grass? Then it's going to provide water quality, keeps runoff going into the river, soil compaction, soil health, provides a corridor for your birds from this big grassland down here to the north. There's a lot of benefits, and it's save farmers time trying to farm it, wasting fuel, trying to get the digger out there, get the field ready to plant, and then run fertilizer and seed. Since seed's not really cheap these days, and fuel, it would make sense. How about on the east side of the river?
Maybe fill in some of those smaller areas with grassland or more trees.
Yeah.
I'd go along the edge and square it up a little bit, so you can weave it in and out.
Right. Yep, exactly. Square it up. Everybody likes a square field, especially with the technology we have today. Auto steer, the straighter the road you get, the more accurate you are, the less ground you waste and the less turning you have to do. So, you guys are right, planting along the field edges there. Probably square up a little more, but kind of get away from the trees. You're probably losing anyways, money, trying to farm the edge anyways with the row trees there. Fill in that little gap, have a little space to turn, square it up. So just time is money. So make it easier for everybody to plant, and less turns you have to do, a lot easier. Maybe plant some trees, connect that little horse shape here. Plant trees in it, plant some quality oak trees, or whatever kind of hickory trees to let it provide fill day in, provide a little more buffer area, provide water quality, a little transition zone for your deer. Another thing is then we could put cover crop on the remaining of the field. That'll provide soil health throughout the year, cover in the winter, keep from erosion, keep from running into the timber, into the river in the early spring when we usually get our heavy rains, and provide food in the spring and the summer, provide food for the deer in the winter to something to munch on, as well while they have a nice little cover on the south side, kind of move north and south, kind of a good corridor. As Nicole was saying, is have a continuity, connectivity. So Go back. So now this is a grassland. This is a site that I worked on a few years ago. It was an old CRP. We converted to a RIM WRP. Was all brome. So for food source wise, what would you do out here to try and manage it to improve? It was an old brome field. What would you guys do, short term and long term? What do you guys think to help improve the habitat and water quality?
Try and get rid of the brome one way or another.
Yeah.
And improve the habitat.
Yeah. Yeah, that worked too. That's what we kind of did. We kind of disked it all up, burned it, disked it up, replanted it to natives. Let it grow. It came back, then brome infestation. Now, how would you kind of manage it for what I kind of said earlier? How would you kind of manage it to try to get the grass back after we did all that work and brome started to come back in?
Mid-season burn.
Yep, burning.
I put 300 cow calf bears down there. Pounded into the ground.
That's exactly what we did. They just got done grazing it this year. You kind of can see the off colors of it. You kind of see their paddocks there. So that's when we kind of pounded it in the ground, killed the brome, try to rejuvenate that natives. It really, with the landowner, I was talking to the landowner, he said he's been seeing a lot more birds out there. They haven't seen for many, many years. The vegetation is different heights, so it's really good, been really good habitat for birds. And it's providing this oasis deer out there. Another thing is on the south end there, you kind of see a food plot. Kind of provide a food because everything there is all grass. It's right next to the DNR property. Have a little good. They usually plant corn. Always see pheasants in there. They kind of hide in their tree grove. Tree groves have predator issues, but they can be really good cover as well, especially in the winter. Especially if it's really thick and woolly and the grove has not been taken care of, so you don't have straight rows. It's just combined brush and overgrown trees. But food plot is good, provide food source for them, for birds and deer. And grazing, it's really turned out a really nice area. There's some wetland, there's some willow trees growing. We removed some of the willow trees, especially along the dams, berms, because you don't want trees on your berms because they provide holes, and if you provide holes, then the water will drain, and then we have issues. So it's a pretty neat property. We managed it, and hopefully it turns out pretty well in the future as well. So there is a cost share for a lot of this, for these programs. You can make, and they do really relatively decent job to help offset the cost. And you won't make money, and you may not get the full thing paid off, but there's programs that help you pay for it. And so a little easier to do it. Different practices like CRP is a great tool, especially if you got agriculture ground. It's like our first scenario we had for the west of that field. You can put grass in, you get, depending on your soil rates, you get paid for 10 years or 15 years, a certain amount each year. And if it pencils out, a lot of times in those wet areas where you're losing money, you put in grass, you usually are saving money or breaking even, or even in reality making money because you're not running your equipment out there and stuff. And then you got the environment, the EQIP is another good program, especially for your pollinator plantings. Pollinators. Timber work, if you live in a forestry area, it's really another good tool to have to use to do TSI or forest stand improvement. Burning, weed control. CSP, I don't work with CSP. I stay away from CSP. But if you're a row crop producer, it's a good program because they do provide a lot of good services for you. You get paid for doing. Just improve what we're here for, water quality, soil health. And then sometimes it just makes sense to put in the easement. It's can't be farmed. You try farming, it's just wasting time because it floods out every time. And maybe easement might be a good option because you get a one lump, depending on what kind you get, depending on what program you're in. You get one lump sum. It's perpetual, you still own it, but you get paid for it, compensated for it. And then you got your state fundings, and then you got others such as PF, Native, Prairie, other private agencies or groups that have money to help you restore land. Other than that, where to start from? A lot of you guys might work for the industries. We got farm biologists. Feel free to give us a call. If you're a landowner, give us a call. That's what we're here for. Think we know everything? No, we don't know everything, but we know the resources of people that know them, knows that we don't know. So, if you want to get started, contact us. We kind of grow from there. Go from there and get some habitat on the ground while improve water quality and habitat.